Blog Talk Radio.
Welcome to another edition of Carnivore Radio. I'm your host, Jeff Sherman, along with Dr. Eric Lopkin, and we're expecting Chris Calandra to chime in and join the conversation and talk about the economic repercussions of what's been going on for the last several months. But, Eric, you have some interesting information to start things, don't you?
Before we get to that, we've got to talk about Joe Biden's interview this morning. And, here's the clip for anyone who hasn't heard about it.
Listen, you got to come see us when you come to New York, VP Biden.
I will.
It's a long way until November. We got more questions.
You got more questions. But I tell you, if you have a problem figuring out whether you're for me or Trump, and you ain't black.
This clip went viral after he said it. For those people who aren't familiar with the show he was on, he was being interviewed by an African-American reporter named Charlemagne the God. And Charlemagne's basic focus is he wants to see what's going to be good for his community. And, he asks questions about that. At the very end of the show, he's inviting Joe Biden to come on the air when the studio gets when the quarantine gets lifted and they can both be in the studio. And Biden comes back with that clip saying, well, if you can't make up your mind by now, you ain't black. The internet has gone nuts. And I love the fact that Joe Biden, the racist, is a hashtag that's trending after this.
Well, it's a racist comment. I mean, if you're not Jewish, if you're not, Polish, I mean, you don't do that. I mean, he's been in the bunker. Every time he gets out, it's a disaster. I don't know how he's 9 points ahead in the polls, but that's probably for bigger minds than me. Dr. Lopkin?
Yeah, it is amazing that he would say things like this. And we do have Chris Calandra in studio, so I'm going to actually throw it to Chris. Chris, did you hear the quote, and what's your outlook on this?
I did hear it, not live, of course, but Joe Biden's campaign continues to struggle, and him saying that, I think is going to harm his campaign and dominate the news for quite a while. It's just completely insensitive.
Chris, will it really dominate the news? If it was Trump, it would crush the news. I think it'll be like a wimp. I think it'll be a little barely anything, a mouse in the corner.
I don't know about that. It's already been all over MSNBC, CNN. These are the guys that are trying to protect him. So if they're covering it, I don't know that it's going to go away so quickly.
I'm very surprised, and that's my honest opinion. Just happened today. I thought they would squelch it, but obviously I'm wrong. Chris, your view on that?
I think his campaign has struggled as he's made lots of gaffes along the way as he's trying to run a campaign out of his basement. And I think this is the one that will get more attention than the others. And I think that the black community and the media and leadership in the black community will be really hard-pressed to ignore this. So I think it will get more play in the media compared to other things Joe Biden has said that have been kind of quirky, let's say.
But don't you think this whole thing about him hiding out in his basement is convenient? I mean, yes, there's the coronavirus, I get it, but it's very convenient, isn't it, that they can kind of quarantine him, I'm talking figuratively, not to get in front of the camera.
Yes, it is convenient. I mean, it has hurt his campaign, but Jeff, your point is a good one.
I think it's helped his campaign. If he's out there, it's a disaster.
Yeah. Lots of people would say that it's hurt his campaign less than if actually he was able to campaign and to be out on the stump, because he just doesn't have the fastball any longer. And so this is a way that he could stay kind of cocooned. Probably works to his advantage. This seems a lot like the Hillary Clinton campaign to me, where the more you see him, the less impressed you are. And I think that was an element in Hillary Clinton's campaign. The more you saw her, the less you liked her. So, yeah, maybe this has helped him a bit.
I would agree, but this is another level, gentlemen, and for our listeners out there, because I think for me, it's a little scary, because I think he's ill-equipped for the presidency or almost any. He's basically, forget about the fastball, there's something seriously wrong, and I'm not being partisan. I think it's scary that the Democrats have propped him up, and he is not equipped for the job.
No, he really isn't. And I think something that was interesting that was talked about in the interview was the fact that the host had actually heard the rumor that Amy Klobuchar was the front runner to be the VP. And his comment on this, now, I don't know much about Charlemagne the God. I don't know if he's got a big following in the African-American community, but he indicated that if Joe Biden did not pick an African-American woman as his running mate, then at least his followers in the African-American community were not going to support him. And Biden's response was he wouldn't comment on who's being vetted and who's a front runner, but he has considered several African-American women. At that point in the interview, his aide tries to cut off the interview, saying they're out of time, he's got to get going. Now, I don't know anybody, any reporter that would put up with a guest saying, well, that's it, especially in a live setting, that's it, I'm done, I have to go. And to his credit, Charlemagne did not put up with it. He challenged Joe Biden on this, and Joe Biden used the excuse, well, his wife has to make a 6 o'clock appearance. Well, that shouldn't have anything to do with it. All these appearances are being done in Zoom. You're telling me the vice president only has one computer that's capable of doing a video conference?
I mean, yes, I agree with all of that. But the whole real issue is he's avoiding any kind of introspection, isn't he, Chris?
He is. And you mentioned the aide cutting the interview off, maybe short, maybe not. I can't remember another instance where a major political candidate has an aide have them on such a tight leash. And this is at least the second time I've seen an interview where an aide has ended an appearance by Joe Biden. And you're talking like 5-6 minutes. And it's another sign that even his staff knows that the longer he goes, the greater the risk is that he says something inappropriate or harmful to the campaign. Even that's kind of weird that the aide is cutting him off on a live interview like that. You don't see that for such a high-profile campaign. You
really don't. And, I mean, in Biden's defense, we've actually said on this podcast that it would be useful for Trump to have somebody who could keep him on script when he's making a speech. So I completely understand why they've got somebody doing it.
Yeah, but not
to
actually
this level. Interrupt a live interview, that's just amazing.
No, I agree. But I still am perplexed that last week, it's not last week, maybe 2 weeks ago, Trump had leads in all swing states, and now it's a 9-point. I know it's a national poll. How is Biden ahead? I'll throw it out to you, Chris. You're a guest.
Well, I think, first off, I think we could all agree that polls in May are suspect to begin with. I also would offer up that the polls are very misleading. They consistently underrepresent Republicans in the polling. And some of these polls that I've seen, you have them polling as little as 45 people in a particular state. So I think that these polls are, they're not very rigorous. So I don't put much stock in them. I always believe that Donald Trump is undercounted in the polling because the polls are skewed. And I also think a number of respondents, they just don't want to put up with the hassle, and they don't say really that they're Trump supporters because they don't want the trouble of being pushed back against being, say it racist or misogynist. I think it's a little like the silent majority from a few generations ago. So I don't really believe the polls personally.
But I mean, let's
big
analyze what he said, though. Let's analyze what he said. I'm sorry. Let's analyze what he said, though. I mean, what he said, my God, how racist is? I mean, that's racist. It really is, and it's demeaning.
Yeah, I mean, set aside the racist part. I mean, one of my big complaints, and Eric, I think you and I agree on this, is I really have tremendous disdain for elitist attitude. And, both parties can portray that. This, to me, aside from the racism part of things, is also the height of elitism. It's like, you're either, if you're not with me, then you're not true to your heritage. I mean, it's just so elitist and so arrogant, and it's such misplaced arrogance. It really shows how out of touch Joe Biden, I think really is. And then you overlay onto that, it's very racially insensitive.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's definitely racial. Yeah, it's definitely racially insensitive. But I think you're looking at, you brought up the elitist part of this. You're looking at a problem that's endemic with the Democratic Party. Because if you remember in 2016, Michelle Obama said if you didn't vote for Hillary, if you were a woman and didn't vote for Hillary, you weren't being true to yourself. And this is basically the same comment to a different audience.
And there was the Madeleine Albright said that if you don't vote for Hillary, there's a special place in hell for you.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of that. Going back to the polling for a minute, there is a major problem with the methodology of these national polls. And that is, first of all, we know from the polling in 2016 that Trump supporters don't answer the polls. But because of the methodology, they're interviewing people in New York, Chicago, California, and then they're doing a statistical analysis to say, well, these are representative of how many people. Well, you're probably getting 99% pro-Biden in those areas, and then you're doing a statistical analysis on the largest populations in the country, saying, oh, well, this is how they feel. So it just naturally ends up skewing the results towards the Democrats. And
no question,
unfortunately, the pollsters know this, and they haven't figured out a better way to do these polls.
I think they figured it out. They just don't want to. Do you think he, some way, and I think we talked about this in the podcast, Eric, I just, in my gut, and you guys comment on this, I think he finds some way, and his handlers find some way to avoid the debates, because it's not going to go well.
Again, I think they're going to try, but I don't think they'll succeed. It's too big a negative on him to pull out of a debate.
Interesting.
I would agree with Eric. I would agree with Eric, Jeff, that there's very little likelihood that we would go through a presidential election without debates. I don't believe that the American people would accept a race without some form of debate. So I think we'll get them.
Interesting. Now, it always is, Carville would say it's the economy stupid. Go ahead. I'm sorry, Eric.
Before we move on to the economy, we need to take a quick break for our sponsor. We'll be right back.
Hi, Chuck. Elmo wants to know, what is the census?
The census is a special time when we count every single person in the country.
Do kids and babies count, too?
Of course. Counting everyone in your home helps support your neighborhood by funding schools, hospitals, and more. So complete the census by calling, going online, or returning your form by mail. It's totally private.
Visit 2020census.gov and
make your family count.
Brought to you by Carnegie Corporation of New York and the Ad Council.
And we're back. And if you want to be part of the conversation, you can call us at 563-999-3693. That's 563-999-3693. If you want to talk about what's going on in the economy, or you want to comment on the previous conversation with Joe Biden, give us a call.
Awesome. Now, Chris, your real focus is on the economy, and Carville said, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 25 years ago, that it's the economy, stupid. What say you?
I think it is the economy, stupid, and Trump's chances at re-election, I think, largely hinge on his ability or the ability of the country to reopen and to begin moving in the right direction. I don't think he needs to have a rip-roaring economy like he had going into the pandemic, but the economy is going to need to see significant signs of improvements in terms of unemployment in particular and GDP growth. And if you don't see things moving in the right direction with the economy and the reopening after the pandemic, President Trump, regardless of how good or bad his opponent might be, is going to be in deep trouble.
I would agree with that. Eric, what do you think?
Yeah, he's right on the money. It's all about the economy. If people get back to work, I think the two big numbers that are going to predict how well he does is the unemployment rate and the GDP. If the GDP starts going up again and we're definitively not in a recession and people get back to work, then he's still got his 60% chance that I've been giving him of getting reelected. If, however, people don't return to work, if the reopening goes too slowly and, say, small businesses go out of business, and people don't start spending like they did, then you're going to see him have a major uphill battle.
And Chris, to Eric's point, his base is really small business owners, not the multinationals. At the hairdressers, the barbers, the small restaurants, if they're out of work, maybe permanently, I believe, to Eric's point, he's in big trouble, isn't he?
Yes, I think one of the parts of his coalition is the entrepreneurial class, which I consider myself part of. And the entrepreneurial class under President Obama largely felt left out of the conversation. And Donald Trump has been a champion, at least with his rhetoric, if not with his policies. And during the pandemic and the shutdown, where you have Walmart able to open up, but your local boutique not able to, Amazon could still operate, but your local nail salon cannot, that entrepreneurial small business, Main Street small business owner is struggling and has gotten knocked around, and Donald Trump cannot afford to lose that part of his coalition.
Do you think it's become political that some blue state governors and maybe the higher-ups that maybe influence that decision-making see this as an opportunity to take them out? They tried impeachment. They tried other things. This may be their holy grail, correct?
It could be. That's an interesting question. In the state of Connecticut with Governor Malloy, he's Connecticut was one of the last states to begin reopening.
Lamont.
Lamont. What did I say?
Yeah. Malloy.
Malloy.
Oh, yeah. Thank you.
Folks from Connecticut so traumatized by Governor Malloy.
Yeah, that was a little PTSD.
And as an aside, that was 8 years that set this state. I don't know if we'll ever recover from them, but that's another show, I believe.
So to answer your question, sorry about the mistake, is I'm not sure if the governor's motives are really to get Trump, or is it more that you get to see what their true beliefs are, where the government has a heavy hand, doesn't place a lot of trust with the man on the street, and really tries to micromanage everything from a top-down approach. I think it's more of that, personally, than the get Trump kind of attitude, because you look at Governor Kemp in Georgia and Governor DeSantis in Florida, and also Governor Abbott in Texas. They've been more liberal with loosening the reins on the economy, and I think that's a little bit of just the conservative Republican ethos of less government and a lighter touch with government. And
but
it seems to have worked in those states.
But isn't it more than that? I mean, maybe I'm a conspiracy theorist, but I actually think that the Democrats see this as a huge opportunity to initiate their true beliefs in terms of government taking more and more control.
Well, that goes back to something we mentioned on the Carnivore Bites podcast, where there's an old political axiom, never waste a crisis. During the Great Recession, the Democrats basically tried to add more government to businesses, more oversight, more paperwork, and it slowed down our recovery. Trump removed most of that. Now they want to get that back. They want to be in charge. They want you to rely on the government. And of course, you're seeing now that the party is basically working together. You did have the quote unquote Heroes Act that the Democrats in the House pushed through. Again, with virtually no Republican support. I think there was one Republican that voted for it. Why? Because this included bailing out the Democratic states that have been mismanaged for years. And they're saying, well, they need the help because of COVID. No, Connecticut doesn't need the help because of COVID. New York doesn't need the help because of COVID. California doesn't need the help because of COVID. They need the help because for the past decade, it's been mismanaged.
Well, let's talk about mismanagement just for a second. Trump has been just pummeled with his so-called mismanagement of this pandemic. But Cuomo in New York, I don't hear anything about what he's done, and he's done many things to mismanage it, including the whole thing about senior citizen centers, sending people back to recover. Many deaths. Not really, very little about that, correct? And yet he's on every day as the hero.
Yeah, Cuomo did so much wrong, it's not even funny. Starting with the fact that he actually refused to quarantine New York City and keep the pandemic from spreading to the rest of the country. So a lot of what's going on can be laid at the feet of Cuomo and de Blasio. There's been a lot of uproar. No, because first of all, the media is based in New York. So they're his supporters. They're the ones that are seeing all of this horrific things going on and don't really care about the fact that the rest of the country is not being affected the same way that New York was, primarily because of population density. But they're also, they've backed him for years. And, they made a big deal about the fact that New York hospitals did not have enough beds to handle this crisis. But in all of those stories, they left out the fact that prior to this pandemic, in order to save money, the governor and the mayor of New York shut down 20,000 beds in hospitals. So, of course, they didn't have enough because they removed them.
Speaking of, in terms of controversy on the pandemic, how about the Columbia University study that basically indicated that if Trump shut down things 2 weeks earlier, that 20, 30, whatever thousand deaths would be avoided. Does that get traction? Chris, you're our guest.
Well, I think it's hindsight that if anyone acted earlier, it would have been better. But that has the benefit of 20/20 hindsight. And if you also read the footnotes in that study, I think it says that, these models are unpredictable, and it's really as much guesswork as it is a scientific study. But I think clearly if the country, including President Trump, would have acted earlier, we would have had less deaths. And it's true for Governor Cuomo, for Mayor de Blasio, Dr. Fauci, as late as late January. I mean, he was saying things different from what he was saying a month later. He was not ringing the bell of caution in a significant way in interviews he was doing in late January. So, I mean, the whole country was a little late on this. So, yes, if we would have acted earlier, we would be better. Donald
Does it
Trump
have political traction, though, Chris? Does it have political traction?
I don't believe for most people it does. I think most people who support Donald Trump will say, hey, listen, nobody, let me say it this way, Jeff. In January, February, did you think this was a serious thing? No, I didn't think it was serious.
Actually, it's very interesting that you bring that up, Chris, because I would say, I don't know, January, maybe February, I was like, wow, who knows what's going to happen. And then like 2 weeks later, I was like, oh, my God. I'm not being very articulate, but you get my point. It was like, whoa, this is, what's going on here? And then all of a sudden it was like, whoa. So it did sneak up on a lot of people.
Yeah, so I think Donald Trump will get some blame for it, but I think most Americans would look at it and say, who would have thought we would end up where we are? This didn't happen with swine flu, didn't happen with Ebola, didn't happen with MERS or SARS, doesn't happen with the flu each year. And, if you didn't like Donald Trump going into this, you're going to criticize him heavily. If you liked Donald Trump going into this, you still like him. And if you're rather neutral, I think you would say that all leaders in states were a little slow to react, and so was the American population.
Eric?
Yeah, I think there's really 3 points that need to be focused on. One, the fact is, this was not a scientific study. This was a computer model trying to predict what could have happened. Well, there's been hundreds of computer models. None of them agree with each other, and many of them don't agree with what actually happened. So it's not really, scientifically valid. It's just, something that people are looking at. 2, of course, if people had reacted faster, it would have, saved more lives. 3, politically, I don't think it's going to hurt Trump, because all he has to do is trot out the video of Nancy Pelosi telling everybody to gather in Chinatown at the beginning of the pandemic. So it's not that the Trump administration, fell short. Everybody fell short.
Yes. And Eric, let me just add that there's also a video of Joe Biden criticizing the president's decision to not allow flights from China, accusing the president of being a xenophobe. And, certainly that's not going to be helpful to the accusations that Donald Trump didn't do enough early on, because did do, even if it wasn't enough, was roundly criticized in a very personal attack against the president.
Good. All right, we're hitting the end of our show. So, Chris, thanks for coming on. We'll have you on again
pleasure.
Soon.
Thank you.
And you can catch us live here every Friday at blogtalkradio.com/Carnivore Radio. You can catch the replay as well as the Carnivore Bites podcast. at the Apple Podcasts app, Google Play, iHeartRadio, and wherever you find podcasts. See you next week.
Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Jeff.